Good afternoon, class. I hope you're all having a good day. Today we're going to start our unit on the Roaring 20s, focusing specifically on the life and culture in America in the 1920s. Please follow along in your note taker and fill in the blanks as we proceed through the presentation. The Roaring 20s lesson objective for today. All students will be able to identify and explain the cultural contributions of groups and individuals with 80% accuracy by correctly identifying and explaining 4 out of 5 individuals and or groups' contributions to the United States history during the 1920s correctly. Essential questions. You should be able to answer these. How did events during World War I form the mindset of Americans at the beginning of the Roaring 20s? 2. How did mass consumption and various forms of consumerism lead to the prosperity of America in the 20s? 3. What various forms of social culture led to a new form of society in the 20s? Changing ways of life. During the 1920s, urbanization continued to accelerate. For the first time, more Americans lived in cities than in rural areas. New York City was home to over 5 million people in 1920. Chicago had nearly 3 million. Remember, this is a transition from urban to rural, from rural to urban, which means from the country to the city. Urban versus rural. Throughout the 1920s, Americans found themselves caught between urban and rural cultures. Urban life was considered a world of anonymous crowds, strangers, moneymakers, and pleasure seekers. Rural life was considered to be safe, with close personal ties, hard work, and morals. Prohibition. One example of the clash between city and farm was the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1920. This amendment launched the era known as Prohibition. The new law made it illegal to make, sell, or transport liquor. Prohibition lasted from 1920 to 1933 when it was repealed by the 21st Amendment. Remember, the only way to change an amendment is through another amendment. Support for prohibition. Reformers had long believed that alcohol led to crime, child and wife abuse, and accidents. Supporters were largely from rural South and West. The church-affiliated Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Unit helped push the 18th Amendment through. Posters supporting prohibition. Speakeasies and bootleggers. Many Americans did not believe drinking was a sin. Most immigrant groups were not willing to give up drinking. To obtain liquor illegally, drinkers went underground to hidden saloons known as speakeasies. People also bought liquor from bootleggers who smuggled it in from Canada, Cuba, and the West Indies. Organized crime. Prohibition contributed to the growth of organized crime in every major city. Chicago became notorious as the home of Al Capone, a famous bootlegger. Capone took control of the Chicago liquor business by killing off his competition. Al Capone was finally convicted of tax evasion charges in 1931. Government fails to control liquor. Eventually, Prohibition's fate was sealed by the government, which failed to budget enough money to enforce the law. The task of enforcing Prohibition fell to 1,500 poorly paid federal agents, clearly an impossible task. Support fades and Prohibition will be repealed. By the mid-1920s, only 19% of Americans supported Prohibition. Many felt prohibition caused more problems than it solved. The 21st Amendment finally repealed prohibition in 1933. Science and religions clash. Denying evolution, creation, scientism, and the nature of science. Another battleground during the 1920s was between fundamentalist religious groups and secular thinkers over the truths of science. The Protestant movement, grounded in a literal interpretation of the Bible, is known as fundamentalism. Fundamentalists found all truth in the Bible, including science and evolution. The Scopes Trial. In March 1925, Tennessee passed the nation's first law that made it a crime to teach evolution. The ACLU, short for the American Civil Liberties Union, promised to defend any teacher willing to challenge the law. John Scopes did. Scopes was a biology teacher who dared to teach his students that man derived from lower species. The Scopes Trial. The ACLU hired Clarence Darrow, the most famous trial lawyer of the era, to defend Scopes. The prosecution countered with William Jennings Bryan, the three-time Democratic presidential nominee. Scopes Trial. The trial opened on July 10, 1925, and became a national sensation. In an unusual move, Darrow called Bryant to the stand as an expert on the Bible. The key question: should the Bible be interpreted literally? Under intense questioning, Darrow got Bryant to admit that the Bible can be interpreted in different ways. Nonetheless, Scopes was found guilty and fined $100. Despite the guilty verdict, Darrow got the upper hand during his questioning of Bryant. Section 2. The 20s, Women. After the tumult of World War I, Americans were looking for a little fun in the 1920s. Women were becoming more independent and achieving greater freedoms. Right to vote, more employment, freedom of the auto. The flapper. During the 1920s, a new ideal emerged for some women, known as the flapper. A flapper was a young and emancipated young woman who embraced the new fashions and urban attitudes. New roles for women. The fast-changing world of the 1920s produced new roles for women. Many women entered the workplace as nurses, teachers, librarians, and secretaries. However, women earned less than men, were kept out of many traditional male jobs, and faced discrimination. The changing family. American birth rates declined for several decades before the 1920s. During the 1920s, that trend increased as birth control information became widely available. Birth control clinics opened, and the American Birth Control League was founded in 1921. Modern family emerges. As of 1920 unfolded, many features of the modern family emerged. Marriage was based on romantic love. Women managed the household and finances, and children were not considered laborers, wage earners, but rather developing children who needed nurturing and education. Section 3. Education and Popular Culture. During the 1920s, developments in education had a powerful impact on the nation. Enrollment in high schools quadrupled between 1914 and 1926. Public schools met the challenge of educating millions of immigrants. Expanding news coverage. As literacy increased, newspaper circulation rose, and mass circulation magazines flourished. By the end of the 1920s, 10 American magazines, including Reader's Digest and Time, boasted circulations of over 2 million. Radio comes of age. Although print media was popular, radio was the most popular communications medium to emerge in the 1920s. News was delivered faster and to a larger audience. Americans could hear the voice of the president or listen to the World Series live. American heroes of the 1920s. In 1929, Americans spent $4.5 billion on entertainment, including sports. People crowded into baseball games to see their heroes. Babe Ruth was a larger-than-life American hero who played for the Yankees. He hit 60 home runs in 1927. Charles Lindbergh, Lindbergh's flight. America's most beloved hero of the time wasn't an athlete, but a small-town pilot named Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh made the first non-stop solo transatlantic flight. He took off from New York City in the spirit of St. Louis and arrived in Paris 33 hours later to a hero's welcome. Entertainment and arts. Even before sound movies offered a means of escape through romance and comedy. First sound movies were Jazz Singer in 1927, first animated with sound Steamboat Willie in 1928. By 1930, millions of Americans went to the movies each week. Music and art. Famed composer George Gershwin merged traditional elements with American jazz. Painters like Edward Hopper depict the loneliness of American life. George O'Keeffe captured the grandeur of New York using intensely colored canvases. Writers of the 1920s. The 1920s is one of the greatest literary eras in American history. Sinclair Lewis, the first American to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, wrote the novel Babbitt. In Babbitt, the main character ridicules American conformity and materialism. Writers of the 1920s. F. Scott Fitzgerald coined the phrase the Jazz Age to describe the 1920s. Fitzgerald wrote Paradise Lost and The Great Gatsby. The Great Gatsby reflected the emptiness of New York's elite society. Writers of the 20s. Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence dramatized the clash between traditional and modern values. William Cather celebrated the simple, dignified lives of immigrant farmers in Nebraska in My Antonia. Ernest Hemingway, wounded in World War I, became one of the best-known authors of the era. In his novel, The Sun Also Rises and A Farewell to Arms, he criticized the glorification of war. His simple, straightforward style of writing set the literary standard. The Lost Generation. Some writers, such as Hemingway and John Dos Passos, were so soured by American culture that they chose to settle in Europe. In Paris, they formed a group that one writer called the Lost Generation. Section 4. The Harlem Renaissance. Between 1910 and 1920, the Great Migration saw hundreds of thousands of African Americans move north to big cities. By 1920, over 5 million of the nation's 12 million blacks lived in cities. African American goals. Founded in 1909, the NAACP, which stands for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, urged African Americans to protest racial violence. W.E.B. Du Bois, a founding member, led a march of 10,000 black men in New York to protest violence. Marcus Garvey believed that African Americans should build a separate society. In 1914, Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Garvey claimed 1 million members by the mid-1920s. He left a powerful legacy of black pride, economic independence, and Pan-Africanism. Harlem. Harlem became the largest black urban community. Harlem suffered from overcrowding, unemployment, and poverty. However, in the 1920s, it was home to a literary and artistic revival known as the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance. African American writers. The Harlem Renaissance was primarily a literary movement, led by well-educated blacks with a new sense of pride in the African American experience. Claude McKay's poems expressed the pain of life in the ghetto. Langston Hughes. Born in Missouri, he was the movement's best-known poet. Many of his poems described the difficult lives of working-class blacks. Some of his poems were put to music, especially jazz and blues. Zora Neale Hurston wrote novels, short stories, and poems. She often wrote about the lives of poor, unschooled Southern blacks. She focused on the culture of the people, their folkways, and values. African American performers. During the 1920s, black performers won large followings. Paul Robeson, son of a slave, became a major dramatic actor. His performance in Othello was widely praised. Louis Armstrong. Jazz was born in the early 20th century. In 1922, a young trumpet player named Louis Armstrong joined the Creole Jazz Band. Later, he joined Fletcher Henderson's band in New York City. Armstrong is considered the most important and influential musician in the history of jazz. His nickname was the Great Satchmo. Edward Kennedy, known as Duke Ellington. In the late 1920s, Duke Ellington, a jazz pianist and composer, led his 10-piece orchestra at the famous Cotton Club. Ellington won renown as one of America's greatest composers. Bessie Smith was a blues singer, was perhaps the most outstanding vocalist of the decade. She achieved enormous popularity, and by 1927, she became the highest paid black artist in the world. This concludes today's lesson. If you have any questions, please send me an email or write them down and text me, and I'll get back to you with an answer as quickly as possible. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and the lesson. Please make sure to answer the essential questions and the unit objective in your exit ticket. Thanks, and have a good afternoon.